Theresa May has issued a warning to peers that they could incentivise the European Union to offer Britain a bad deal on Brexit. The House of Lords is expected to vote tomorrow on an amendment calling for Parliament to be given a meaningful vote on the withdrawal agreement. And I'm joined now by Lord Lamont, former Conservative Chancellor and Leave campaigner. Are you incentivising the EU to give Britain a bad deal?
Well, I think the Prime Minister is quite right that if the House of Lords voted so that Parliament could reject a deal as not sufficient for Britain's purposes, Britain would be left in a very weak position, having to go back to Europe and say, the deal you've given us isn't good enough, please give us a better one. I mean, we would be in a ridiculous position. Also, what some people in the House of Lords seem to want is that Parliament could vote against whatever is negotiated and say, well, we ought to remain in the EU, and that would be to deny the result of the referendum. But I think the point the Prime Minister makes is absolutely right.
Do you think the Lords will vote to pass it?
I don't know. I very much hope not. And if they do, I hope that it won't be a prolonged ping-pong. I hope they will be overruled by the House of Commons, and then I hope that will be that. But I do believe, I mean, I don't want to appear threatening, I do believe the House of Lords would be calling itself into question by doing this. I mean, we have had a referendum. The result was clear. The question was simple. It was unambiguous. It ought to be accepted. And these tactics of trying to slow things down, make it awkward, they're not really consistent with the result of the referendum. There are some people who actually just won't accept the fact that the country voted to leave.
So on the terms of what the country did vote for, the reasons why people voted for the referendum are myriad, aren't they? We don't know exactly why people voted to stay, why people voted to leave. Immigration was a key thing in many people's minds, we know that. Do you think Brexit will allow Britain to actually take control of its immigration?
I do think it will allow Britain to take control of immigration. I'm sure we will continue to have quite a lot of immigration from Britain, but I think we will have a sort of soft work permit system whereby we will allow people with the right skills who have guaranteed jobs to come here. I think we've had a rather indiscriminate immigration policy, and I think many people would like to see it tightened up.
What about the people who are coming here to the UK from outside the EU? Still huge numbers, around 50% of immigrants coming from those areas. That's not going to be affected at all, though, is it?
No, that's right. That has to be tackled similarly. That hasn't come down. It's been a poor result as far as the government are concerned. The last figures did show a bit of a drop, but more needs to be done. I think we also have to be stricter about illegal immigration. It's a complicated subject, I quite agree, and I do think non-EU immigration has to be reduced as well.
What about trade? We've seen the news about the car industry today. I mean, it does appear that current workers working for Vauxhall have stability in the short term at least. But does that not give you any cause for concern that in the long term, industries like the car industry could become a lot more twitchy, could decide to close plants inside the UK because they have quite a lot of them in Europe already?
Well, the issue of what will happen to Vauxhall is a sort of one company issue, and obviously there'll be a lot of bargaining as to where they locate all their plants. As regards the car industry more generally, I don't think Britain has anything really to fear, because it's manifestly in Europe's interest, and particularly Germany's interest, to have the maximum possible free trade in automobiles, not to have tariffs on motor cars. We are the largest market for German cars. We alternate with the United States. Sometimes they're the number one, sometimes we're the number one. But the UK market matters enormously to Germany, and so I can't believe that the EU, which I assume is rational, is going to penalise people wanting to sell cars in Britain. It's a two-way thing. It's in both our interests and that of the EU to have free trade in components and in completed motor cars.
As we creep nearer to Brexit, what about the actual nuts and bolts of it actually working? What about Northern Ireland? What do you think should happen there in terms of borders?
Well, that is a very tricky issue indeed. The government have said they're absolutely committed to maintaining the single travel area that has existed since 1923 and ought to be maintained. At the same time, the security arrangements outside the border of the island of Ireland, which operate at the moment, will have to be maintained. The issue of having a border between the EU and the non-EU, of course, is not an unprecedented problem in terms of trade. You get that with Switzerland, you get that with Norway and Sweden as well. And customs procedures are very much automated and electronic, digital now. So I think technical solutions are possible without creating a situation in which you have endless queues of lorries at borders. That would be a terrible thing, and I don't believe it will happen.